I would like to welcome and recognize the presence of, Mr. Tom Arnold, who is trying to join, a member of the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. Professor Tim Benton, who is already here with us, the co-lead authors of the Foresight report, and Professor Sandy Thomas, the director of the Global Panel Secretariat. I also would like to welcome all my FAO colleagues and experts from headquarters in Rome. I see Nancy, sub-regional and country offices throughout Africa. The purpose of our meeting today is to present the Global Panel's report on future food systems for people, our planet, and prosperity. This is an extremely important meeting for us. The theme is urgent. We just finished our 32nd sessions of FAO Regional Conference for Africa in Malabo 2 weeks ago, which was attended by 54 member states. And food systems transformation was the main topic indeed. As we all know, poverty, hunger, and malnutrition is particularly acute in Africa. In 2021, 490 million people in Africa, representing 36% of the total population, were living in extreme poverty. Hunger has worsened significantly since 2014. In 2021, there were more than 281 million hungry people, representing 21% of the population in Africa. The economic recession and disruption in food supply chains induced by the COVID-19 pandemic are taking their toll on the food security and nutrition situation in Africa. And not to mention conflicts on the continent or elsewhere also contribute to worsening the situation. So the report to be presented today will hopefully provide the overview of the situation with regard to the food systems and its future, and at the same time provide strategic recommendations given the worsening situation of hunger and malnutrition around the world. We need stronger partnership and investment to find sustainable solution to this challenge. We need to reinvent our food systems by promoting innovation, leveraging technologies, and capitalizing the power of youth and women, among others. With this background, and without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Tom Arnold, if he's already here, to make his introductory remarks. I wanted to check with Sandy if Tom is here.
I can't see him at the moment, but I mean, Jack, could you just let us know?
I can't get through to him, so I think it'd be good if you could go ahead and deliver his
all right. In this case, Sandy, please go ahead. Thank you. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Yasmi. And I'd just like to begin by apologising for the short notice cancellation that we had to make when we arranged this this meeting previously some months ago. It was unfortunately unavoidable, and this meeting is now replacing that meeting. So I'd like to emphasize just how important a partner FAO has been to the global panel. The Director General has a seat on the panel. There's also been numerous co-hosting of events over the past years, which has really been very fruitful. And FAO has always been a stalwart commentator on all of our briefs and reports that we've sent in draft form. So that technical support has really been very important. That's particularly true for the Foresight report, which Professor Benton is going to present on today very shortly. Now, we all know that the pressure on food systems, which we've just heard about from Mr. Yasmi, has been amplified by the pandemic, of course, and now the crisis in Ukraine. And we're seeing these pressures on food systems increase even more, and reflected in the FAO Food Price Index, which is 33% higher than a year ago, and even 12% higher than February in this year. So this obviously is a very worrying backdrop, but I think the panel's view very much, and I'm sure FAO too, of course, is that it's not too late to act. And I think where our role comes in here, particularly with our partners, is to offer practical solutions, which is what the Foresight report does. And we have this, I think, unique opportunity to act after we've had the really important summit meetings last year. And of course, the Global Food Summit has made, I think, a lot more people, particularly in low middle income countries, aware of the opportunities. And Agnes Kalibata, who is a member of the panel, is a very important champion, I think, in this regard. And two, we have the African Union that has declared this year, 2022, as the year of nutrition. And I think we'll see a lot of opportunity there too. So we can see that within the African region, we really need food systems and nutrition to be at the heart of driving future food system transformation. And in particular, this can be driven in part by young African entrepreneurs, of which we've heard a lot about, I think, through the many different kinds of SMEs that provide food and also process food, particularly, and do provide over 60% of all the food consumed in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a really impressive figure. And clearly there are a very large number of young people, particularly in the 15 to 24 age group in sub-Saharan Africa. Those numbers will reach 283 million by 2030. That's a huge cohort to look for talent and entrepreneurial growth there. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have on how African countries can really show not only continental but also global leadership in transitioning and transforming food systems, helping to stimulate economic growth, but at the same time, particularly this point will be important from Tim's presentation, helping to protect the natural environment and support the delivery of the SDGs. And I think our Foresight report can help support this transition. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Yasmin. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sandy, for these very important introductory remarks. We are indeed in important junctures of development, in particular in Africa, and that's why your report is critical. With that, I would like to provide Professor Tim Benton, the co-lead author, to give us the overview of the report. Professor Benton, over to you.
Dans ce domaine, parce que il y avait cet intérêt-là. Je ne sais pas si vous pouvez contacter ces gens.
Colleagues, before we start the presentation, I would like to kindly request you to mute your microphone, please. Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Benton, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I was in South Africa only a couple of weeks ago, talking to a whole load of people around a research project that I've been running on climate smart agricultural development in Southern Africa, and very much the issues of the region, Africa in general, are very much at the top of mind, because I'm also doing a lot of work on the implications of Ukraine and Russia and how those are driving food price issues all around the world, and will obviously disadvantage the poorest in the global community the most. But anyway, I will try and whiz through this presentation. We can share the slides afterwards, and of course the report is freely available, but I think it's key that we leave some time for discussion. So if I go relatively fast over the background material, and then focus on the kind of core of what we're trying to say, then we can leave space for discussion. So just to begin with, the kind of key messages from the Foresight report are on this slide. We have really serious interlocking crises, which are to do with environmental issues, health issues, and increasingly global economic issues, and the bipolarity or multipolarity of the world as it's developing from a geopolitical perspective. Diets are a really key link between what we as humans need and what the planet needs. And we need to transform our food systems. I think everybody is very well aware of that message post-Food Systems Summit. And we need to put healthy diet sustainably produced as a priority agenda item locally in every country and globally and obviously, particularly for Africa, regionally on the top of the agenda. Every single nation and all actors have important roles to play in the food system transformations. And although people often say, oh, it's too difficult, we'll never do it, actually, there are a lot of things that can be done, as discussed in the food system dialogues. There are a lot of things that can be done today that will help us towards making the future better for us all. So just starting off with the kind of background, I will go through this quickly. We know, obviously, that the food system is responsible for a whole range of environmental issues. A major driver of climate change. About a third of all greenhouse gases are associated with land use change and the production of food. And this applies in multiple dimensions. For whatever crop that we're growing, it has an environmental impact. It varies obviously from produce to produce, but the impact is climate change, land use change, pollution, particularly through fertilizer application and pesticides in some places. Each crop has a kind of different footprint, and part of the need from an environmental perspective in future is to make sure that we're growing the right sorts of agricultural produce with the lowest environmental impacts that can also achieve the nutritional goals that we are all in need of. We know that the environment is suffering from agriculture around the world, and we also know that human health is really being affected on a global basis, not just from the acute issues of chronic hunger, but the impacts of dietary related ill health that comes from eating the wrong amounts of the wrong things. So that's undernutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and increasingly the ill health associated with eating too many calories, but not enough of the nutrition. And it's a global problem, particularly acute in places like sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see from the map, which is darker colors are associated with higher mortality rates attributable to diet. And on a global basis, you know, we did suffer hugely globally from the pandemic, but on a global basis, something like 6 times more people die each year from dietary related ill health than died from COVID in the first full year of the pandemic. Number one mortality factor, number one factor associated with poor health and the consequences of poor health, including economic productivity loss and so on. We know also that diets are changing all over the world, and particularly perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're often changing in the wrong direction. People are increasingly eating more calories, but not enough of the right sorts of things. And this is just a figure with nutrients, and the colored dots, nutrients and food groups, the colored dots should be somewhere around the middle of each of these bars. And you can see for salt and sugar, they're far too high across the world. And for the consumption of some micronutrients like calcium, they're too low. Far too low consumption of fruit and nuts and seeds and so on. And for some things, they are too high. Saturated fat on a global basis is increasingly getting to be a problem. And part of the issue for why poor diets are both prevalent and very expensive is that on a global basis, we don't grow enough of the right sorts of things. Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. So on this figure, on the left-hand side is roughly speaking a pie chart of what we should be eating to have a healthy diet. And on the right-hand side is what the world is growing at the moment, stripping out feed for animals. And what you can see is that were everybody in the world to want to eat a healthy diet like this, we only produce about 1/3 of the fruit and vegetables. We produce on a global basis about 50% too many cereals and starches. 3 times too much oil and fats on a global basis, and 16 times more sugar than we need on a global basis. So there is a fundamental mismatch between what we grow and what we should be growing to underpin healthy diets. And of course, this mismatch means that some foods are cheap because they are oversupplied in the market, and some foods are expensive because they're undersupplied in the market, and particularly the health enhancing ones, fruit and vegetables in this diagram, for example, are not available enough, and therefore they become very expensive. And as a result, if you look at the cost of a healthy diet, a minimally adequate diet from a nutritional perspective, in many parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the dark colors on this map, you can see that healthy diets are effectively unattainable because of that mismatch between what is incentivized by the market and what should be grown from a health perspective. And much of this is to do with the way that the international market for food and agricultural products has been structured over the last 50 or 60 years. And in many ways, it's predicated on a global basis, a commodity crop basis, by the assumption that we should be growing more and more and more food, making it as cheap as possible. And this underlies the kind of the notion that has been driven by the rich world that the diet should become ever cheaper, ever more available, and as a consequence, ever more starchy calorie crop based as opposed to nutrition based, because that's more difficult to make a international market work around. And this CFP, the cheaper food paradigm, which is about agricultural intensification and freeing up trade on global basis, leads to a whole lot of vicious circles that make the system worse. So just going through this diagram quickly, as we drive demand growth for cheaper grains particularly, that leads to agricultural expansion on a global basis. Agricultural expansion leads to biodiversity loss, which leads to yield decline. As we drive down yields because of the impact on the environment, we say, oh, there isn't enough food in the world, we have to grow more food. That turns the wheel of, oh, we need to grow more food more intensively. That drives climate change. Climate change is driving yield decline, and the wheel goes round again. As we expand agriculture, that in turn drives climate change. As we drive climate change, we say, oh, we need more land for storing carbon. That changes the dynamics of competition for land, which in turn leads to agricultural expansion and so on. As we drive intensification, it depletes soils, that drives yield decline, which further means that there is an incentive in the market to intensify further. As we intensify more and more, we make waste economically rational across much of the world. That drives climate change in itself. As we say, we need more and more food and it's got to be cheaper and cheaper, that leads to a concentration in fewer and fewer crops that are internationally marketable. They come from breadbasket regions grown in high intensity monocultures. That leads to biodiversity loss. As we concentrate on fewer and fewer crops, you know, the 75% of the world's calories come from 8 major crops. That means that crops are cheap enough to feed to livestock. People eat more cheap meat, particularly processed meat. That drives malnutrition. The crop concentration means that everybody in the world is eating more or less the same thing, perhaps in different concentrations and cooked and prepared in different ways, but everybody is effectively basing their diets on starchy crops and oil and so on. So we have a global convergence on eating lots of calories, but poor nutrition because we're not growing enough fruit and vegetables. And as we drive climate change, we reduce the nutrient content of the grains, and that in turn contributes to malnourishment. So what we have is a system that we have designed based around a whole lot of market incentives, based around the assumption that food should become more available, cheaper, and driven through international trade, drive economic growth. But this leads to all of these things trading off against each other and making the system worse the more we concentrate on just the normal things that we've done for the last 60 years, which is drive agriculture intensification and open up trade. And of course, this global interconnected food system is also increasingly vulnerable to environmental and other shocks that we are driving. Part of the driving is we're creating climate change. And if you look around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the left-hand pie diagram there, the impact of droughts particularly, but increasingly floods and storms in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa is getting very, very acute. You know, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, we thought the time of famine was behind us. Now, of course, we're realizing that actually our food system is very vulnerable locally, particularly in the most marginalized populations, but globally, as Ukraine is showing us now, because of the relationships between production and trade and prices in local markets, our food system is very vulnerable, leading to a lot of price volatility. And that in turn, when prices go up, means it's more difficult to achieve nutritional outcomes that we need. So all of this says, well, actually, we've got to do more and better to transform the food system to make it better for people on the planet and get away from a bit of the focus that the solution is in growing more maize and only maize or wheat, or depending on wherever you, or rice, depending on wherever you are in the world. So when we're thinking about transforming the food systems, there are two elements that I think are important. One is, in a globally interconnected world, how does a country transform its food system? Because a lot of the production in any country is influenced by or directly contributes to global trade. And this leads to a drag on a country's ability to change things because it has to be integrated into the global market. And so perhaps as we go ahead and think about food system transformation locally, we need to do more about thinking about how groups of countries, whether regional, whether African Union, whether multilateral trade partners, need to come up with effectively an end date, like we have in the energy transition, that there's a net zero date by which we globally commit to reducing our emissions. Perhaps we need something similar, that countries work together to say, we are going to transform our food system by 2050 or whenever that might be, to allow countries not to be undercut by changing their food system locally, but then having their markets flooded by poorer food that's coming from overseas with higher environmental impacts. So part of what the global panel has been doing recently is thinking about how can we get momentum behind thinking about a net zero type sort of target for groups of countries to move towards a transition, and then thinking about how we can put in place local support for individual countries, given that international dynamic, to achieve their food system transformation. And then, of course, not only do you need, well, we're going to transform our food system by thinking, you also need a vision for what your food system transformation should be. So where do you want to end up? And in the Foresight report that was published some time ago now, we say that there are kind of 4 distinct goals in the transition. And this is around making the right sort of food available, the right sort of food, so available in terms of the production of it, the right sort of food accessible so citizens can buy the food or access the food in other ways, the right sort of food affordable. And this is not just about making food cheap, but it's also about social safety net and other things, income growth, to allow people to afford food that might be out of their price range at the moment. And we need to make food that is nutritious and sustainably produced more desirable, so that people are not wanting to eat Kentucky fried chicken and chips or whatever it might be, because that's a kind of an aspirational diet for many of the poor people in the world, in your countries and my country. And there are many things that we can think of, and the report goes in detail about how we actually might, the levers that we might pull, and I'll talk through some of these in a minute or so. But you can see on this slide that making more and better food available is about thinking about how we subsidize agriculture in the right sort of way. How do we prioritize the research and development needs for different sorts of crops and not just commodity crop staples? How do we ensure that there is a production of nutrient-rich foods and not just a production of calorie crops and so on? So there are many kind of game-changing solutions that I'll just briefly talk through in subsequent slides, as laid out in this slide here, about subsidies, about dietary guidelines, about public procurement, about food prices, making the worse more expensive and the better cheaper and more available, about social protection, about trade policies, and about the role of science in developing the right sorts of products scalable to agriculture at the scale that is needed. So just briefly on some of these topics, this is a slide which is very, very complicated, but I'll try and talk through it. The different colors are different food groups. The different blocks of solution are different ways that different subsidy regimes might be reorganized in different ways, with global subsidy spread around the world, global subsidy, local subsidies being changed by themselves. The end point of all of this, and it's too complicated to talk through in great detail, is that were we to repurpose our subsidies, even a small amount of our subsidies, which at the moment on a global level, the 600 billion or so that is spent, were we to repurpose those subsidies towards, say, nutrient-rich crops, more fruit and vegetables, more nuts and so on, we could change the market availability and price of those goods and make them come down. If we were to take some of the subsidies from the calorie crops and put them on fruit and vegetables, it would make some of the calorie crops more expensive, which would make other things more expensive. That in turn would reduce the demand for those things and make a differential adjustment to the way that nutrient-rich crops and nutrient-poor but calorie-full crops were balanced in the market, and they could lead very much to radical changes in consumptions of the right sorts of goods that could underpin healthy diets. So in the report, we highlight some of the ways that the subsidy changes could work through to effectively household food consumptions. And in this figure here, this is illustrating that if we pulled all of the levers that we could do about changing subsidy structure, about reducing waste, etc., changing the market demand, changing the market availability, changing the price, actually a healthy, sustainably produced diet could become much cheaper than the sorts of diets that many countries in the world are currently finding. So the fact that a healthy diet at the moment is too expensive for many doesn't mean that if we pulled the right levers, a healthy diet would not become cheap enough for people to be able to access. And that's partly about eating the right sorts of things in the right amount, but getting them on to the global market to allow people to access them in an economically fair way. The next item beyond subsidies and changing the kind of incentives around market structure is around food-based dietary guidelines. And although many countries across the world, not many in sub-Saharan Africa, although many countries around the world have food-based dietary guidelines, they are often very narrowly focused on micronutrient availability, and they very rarely take into account any of the issues about the environmental costs and benefits of different foods. And part of our thesis is that because they are largely ignored, they are put out there, they're not supported, they're not driven through public policy. No one pays any attention to them. Food-based dietary guidelines are not met. It's a relatively simple and straightforward lever by which you can get policy alignment across health, across environment, and across trade if they were to be properly developed in each of our countries and utilized in a whole range of other policy areas such as school diets, public procurement, and so on. We can also do better around aligning these food-based dietary guidelines with food system transformation. We can use better science. We can tailor the food-based dietary guidelines to what we know today, both from a health and a holistic diet perspective, as well as the environmental perspective. We can change the food-based dietary guidelines instead of being a static thing developed or revised every 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or whatever it might be, but changing as science and local conditions change. As food prices change, our dietary guidelines ought to be able to respond to that. As I say, you can account for environmental implications as well as health implications in dietary guidelines, and they should help with policy alignment, as I have been talking about, and they should be actionable so that individuals and institutions can look at food-based dietary guidelines and translate them into what people might buy in local markets or what might choose to grow. And we need to, as part of the kind of regime change, we need to think about how we address the, beyond the subsidies, beyond the availability, how we address the fiscal relationship between food production and food consumption. And we review in the report some of the information around taxes and targeted subsidies on fruits and vegetables. And although many countries are nervous about taxes being applied to foods, because of the external costs of producing the wrong sorts of foods in the wrong amounts, both for human health and for environmental perspectives, taxes can be effective in terms of changing, as many countries have found, such as with sugar sweetened beverage taxes and so on, changing consumption patterns to support different modes of production and different modes of consumption. And additionally, there are many examples around the world now where targeted subsidies have been given to better diets or better consumption patterns, and so they are an effective policy lever. And we can also, therefore, use the changing prices, the changing food-based dietary guidelines to help enable public procurement to become a lever of change, both in terms of public procurement providing a market for producers, but also in terms of public procurement providing a food environment in which people change their dietary consumption patterns and spread from what they're eating in the public situation to local purchasing that they might make for their households. And as we go through the food system transformation, it's inevitable that some prices will go up in some markets for some goods. And as the world increasingly grapples with the geopolitical change that's coming out of Ukraine and the change in markets, and perhaps move to a bipolar world with less globalization, perhaps even more regionalization, there will be situations where the challenges are really severe for the poorest. So how can we reconfigure and refocus social protection to enable people, as we go through the next decade or two, trying to get the food system right? How can we repurpose social safety nets to ensure that people do not suffer? And clearly, again, within the report, we talk a lot about the different ways that you can enact social safety nets, and some of them are listed on this diagram here, and their different efficacy in terms of are they targeted at helping the poorest, or is the benefit of the social safety net more spread across the whole population, including benefiting the rich that perhaps don't need access to the social safety net. There are different ways of doing it, but there is evidence to show how we can do this. And then before moving to the final section, part of the challenge that I'm acutely aware of, because I've been involved in very much capacity building projects in Southern Africa, is how do we build capacity in the system, both in terms of in industry, in farmers, in citizens, to help them understand the needs to change and access diets, but particularly also in how do we build capacity in governments to align policy across the different areas. And I remember very much having a conversation with a principal private secretary in Malawi a couple of years ago, who over a day's workshop, she said, my job has been to do agriculture. My job's not to do water. My job's not to do trade. My job's not to do health. My job's to do agriculture. And I do what I'm told. And what I am told is to do this. And now I can appreciate that by doing this, I am undermining these other policy areas. But there is no capacity within my government to understand, to train me to understand the implications between my policy area and other policy areas. And so part of the challenge for food system transformation is to get away from just thinking about food system transformation being about agriculture. It's about agriculture, it's about health, it's about trade, it's about environment, it's about understanding climate adaptation, it's also about understanding climate mitigation, and so on. And on this chart here, we've got, just as an example, climate risk, and we've got human health risks here split by countries. And for some areas where there is, for example, a high climate risk and a very significant health risk at the moment, we need to do much better as an international community to help local decision makers build their capacity to deal with these risks together, because they are so deeply integrated. So just very quickly, I won't spend any time on this at all. Transition steps, we need to resolve policy distortions and incoherence. As I've been talking about, we need to align policies across these different areas. We have to establish multi-win targets that have behind them multiple constituencies. So people, producers, industry, policy actors, environmental actors, and so on. We need to leverage existing and planned interventions to the food system. And there are many changes that are ongoing, but we have to make sure that the changes that are ongoing, that we want for agricultural development, for sustainable development goals, really hit all of these targets together. We need to do better to support novel intergovernmental and global initiatives, such as we've been talking about with the net zero goals for food system transformation, and so on. And as we go through the transformation, we have to deal with the trade-offs, because there will be trade-offs between winners and losers, between environment and health, between trade and local food security, and so on. And we can't run away from these trade-offs. We have to address them. And then final word, the UN Food System Summit National Pathways, and we at Chatham House are actually working with the European region of FAO to enable local discussions about food system transformation based on these national pathways. We need to utilize the leverage, the enthusiasm that people engaged with these. It's a unique opportunity to support a transformative process that is ongoing, but we need to make sure that the food system plans for national governments really will end up not with just producing more crops of the wrong type that will enhance environmental impacts and undermine health. We've got to make sure those food system transformations deliver everything we need, which is a resilient food system that supplies nutrition, but doesn't undermine the natural world and therefore come back to bite us later on. So just finally, we've typically had a fragmented approach to policy making, and we need to get over that. We've had and still have distorted economic and political incentives that impede change or drive it in the wrong direction, such as sometimes with the cheaper food paradigm. And transition is needed, but we can transition to a much better place in the long term, it will be challenging, but we can do it because there's enough information now to say in a local context, we should be doing X, Y, and Z. And then just finally, global panel, go to the website. There is an awful lot of information on the website, all of the policy briefs as well as the Foresight reports. And with that, I'm sorry it took a bit longer. I will stop sharing and hand over for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim, for a very rich and important presentation. Now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A, more or less. So I'd like to open the floor, but I also would like to invite colleagues to type your questions on the chat. Any question from you? Please raise your hands if you want to ask question. Okay, I see David. David, please, over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent presentation, Tim. You are probably talking to the already converted. We know these are the issues that we need to solve globally. If the world were one country, I believe we could do much better in handling these. Also, with regard to the issues, the trade-offs, and so on. Unfortunately, the world is in competition with itself. Where the resources are needed most is not where the resources go, because we cannot divorce this discussion to resource. So mine is a comment, really, okay? And FAO, throughout its life, has been trying to actually make policy advice to countries on exactly these things. FAO has an advantage, unlike other UN agencies, in that it deals with all these issues. We just don't look at agriculture as the principal secretary in Malawi was saying. We look at all these many facets of issues. So we know how complex these issues are. When you present them to government, it's like, okay, so where do I start now? So even the budgeting system within a country is not so easy. Yeah, Minister of Health wants this, Minister of Agriculture wants this, Minister for Social Protection wants this. Reality is very complex. So I agree with your conclusions, absolutely. I liked what you said about the fragmentation of issues in terms of policy. I like the fact that we put incentives in the wrong way. There are, of course, political incentives, and the transition will not be easy. I just wish the world was one country. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think part of the way out is to try and build regional alliances to transform systems in tandem or in multidom together. And, you know, if the fallout from Ukraine and Russia leads to a very different world, a bipolar world with two big blocks, you know, an Eastern bloc and a Western bloc, with African countries sometimes jumping perhaps for China-Russia bloc and others for America-Europe bloc, there will be a world where deglobalization is increasingly a reality. If in a world where deglobalization is increasingly a reality, there is increasingly a need for regionalization. And there is a huge role, I think, for the African Union to work together and in some sense not rely on the resource flow that comes to and from the global north, although that's obviously associated with money. But as economic growth happens in the global south, there is at least some opportunity space for regional alliances to tackle these issues together. So whilst you're not working as one country, we are still inevitably going to have regional competition between countries, there is much more of a utility in, I think, pushing ahead some of the regional blocks to work together to deliver food system transformation in tandem in ways that perhaps 5 years ago wouldn't have looked nearly as realizable or plausible as they do from today's world looking ahead 5 or 10 years. So part of the challenge here, I think, is as the world changes so rapidly, how can we use the opportunities of times of change, geopolitical, trade-related change, etc., to make sure that we're collectively heading in the right direction. Over.
Thank you, David and team. Now I also see Muzi, who is going to ask the next question. Muzi.
Yes, thank you so much, Yuri. And I'll also like to voice my thanks to this comprehensive presentation, which is very, very much appreciated and extremely informative. Maybe my intervention, what got my attention and got me thinking was the issue of food-based dietary guidelines, because I think this is an area of work that we are putting a lot of effort on in the continent. So I think the presentation is made me start thinking that probably we are not doing it the right way, because the kind of approach that we are using, we are just using it developing them in a static format, and we don't so much focus on the interlinkages, on their effectiveness on policy, trade, etc. So I think this information has been extremely welcomed. And also to mention that one of the key things in the food-based dietary guidelines, which I will use as probably as an anchor, is that we tend to promote local sourcing, which is fine. And one of the things that we are looking at is we are trying to use the food-based dietary guidelines to include indigenous foods that are locally available. So what I like about the presentation is the importance of the trade-offs, because if Africa, for example, is promoting the African Continental Free Trade Area and the exchange of goods and services, yet at the same time we are saying we have to promote local sourcing, so there will be some trade-offs there. We need to find a way of how we balance this thing together, and at the end of the day come up with win-win solutions. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Muzi, for your comments. I think it's well noted. Very important comments about the trade-off. Now I move to Hernani from Mozambique. Hernani, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Yuri and our colleagues and team. I think thank you very much for this presentation, as I have already posted on my chat. But apart from that, I think I have one remaining point that I would like to hear from you, from your own experience and your view, what lies ahead of in the future. I think from the graphic that you presented, actually what it shows is that actually we are producing more what actually we didn't need it, or actually what that actually is directing us to a much more costly health investment that is required because of our own made. How does this kind of message is being conveyed to or acknowledged or accepted by the OECD countries? I think in this overall global agenda, we need some champions. I think especially for us down here that we are still struggling to feed people, I think it will be very important for us to know whether those countries that are in a better condition to help us in shaping their policy, the right policy for the future, whether they have a good buy-in of what you have presented for us all today. Back to you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, you might want to also address also this comment or question also about urbanizations. How does it impact the food system? We do have a shortage of time, so over to you.
So just dealing with the last question, there is a real challenge, I think, in the market-driven economic growth above all conceptualization of our current food system, not putting people and the planet first. So coming out of COP26, it was very obvious that the solutions to climate smart agriculture was seen by the majority of the world, where many agricultural ministries see themselves as ministries of trade around producing more food to make dollars on a global market, even though that ends up undermining the health and well-being of everybody everywhere. So to a certain extent, there is a challenge as we go through the next decades of how do we think about structural change in the markets to make sure that a profit is being made in producing the right goods. And that is an uphill challenge, but we are, you know, I've been working in this space for 20, 30 years now. We are now at a situation where we are talking about getting the food system right. We've had a UN food system summit. We are talking about transformation of the food system. So compared to where we were 10 years ago, this is not a way out and left field situation. This is gaining global traction. And as we realize the economic costs of environmental change and poor diets, I think we will drive this conversation much more front and central. So we're not producing food for export at the expense of local food insecurity or nutrition insecurity. And to go to Muzi's point, I just put a link in the chat where we've been doing some work in Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and South Africa around thinking about agricultural policy in a climate smart, a climate impacted way. And some of the agricultural policies at the moment are producing food for export, which is leading to undermining the nutritional security of the local population. And no one within those governments is looking at that trade-off at the moment and saying, well, if we go down this path of increasing commodity crops for export, we're not going to have the nutrition available for our local population. So our local population are going to suffer. They're not going to develop in the right way. Productivity will go down and we'll have an economic cost. And no one is actually doing that kind of whole of government thinking. And that's part of the challenge of this space, is to get the whole of government thinking, so we don't have this broad conflicted space that different ministries are doing things in a different way. And then to deal with the urbanization question, yeah, clearly urbanization really impacts things in multiple ways. It impacts local food cultures, because people are divorced from production of food and therefore they tend to move more towards processed food or what's available on local markets. Urbanization reduces the rural population, and the ability to produce food requires greater transport and so on. So depending on the different countries and the balance of urbanization versus ruralization, that will obviously change the policy level advice that is necessary. And we have to get smart about this, but we have to get smarter about gender. We have to get smarter about youth. We have to get smarter about a whole lot of things. And I think my key plea here is not to look back over the last 15 years and say, everything has been about growing more, particularly around being globally embedded, because the world is a different place, and we have to now think just as much about what should we be growing, how much should we be growing, who should we be growing it for, and how should we grow it, then how can we grow more? And I think that will probably be my final word. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and also thank you, colleagues, for this very interesting discussions. Unfortunately, our time is not sufficient. This is always like this. I really would like, on behalf of FAO, to thank the panels, the team for your presentation, and also Sandy for this opportunity to hear firsthand the results of the Foresight report. I think we are on the same lines. FAO has been doing this a lot. And as we see, what is really important is really to push this change on the ground. And you have provided, scenarios, recommendations, data, and we understand that things will only change when we do something on the ground. And our colleagues here from all country offices in Africa have listened from you firsthand on what can be done together with our members, governments in this case. So I think this dialogue, I hope it's just a start, and we will continue this dialogue with the Foresight team. It has been a great opportunity, colleagues. I do not want to summarize this rich discussion, but I do want to emphasize the importance of knowledge exchanges among us. But also it's important, to work together as partners, because change will happen in a significant way if we work together and if we support countries and our very constituency, farmers in this case, consumers, together with the knowledge that we have. With that, once again, team, Sandy, and also I see Jack here. Thank you very much for sharing with us your findings and recommendation. And also I would like to thank my colleagues from headquarters, from regional offices, sub-regional offices, and country offices for their time and interest. Last but not least, kindly note that through Muzi, we will share your PowerPoint team to the participants of this meeting. So colleagues, that's all from me. And I would like to thank everybody. And we finish exactly a few seconds before the hour.